Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Baylor, Director of Communications at NUCA. Welcome to our latest webinar. First, before we begin, some webinar housekeeping for attendees. Today's webinar will be recorded. It will be available in the next few days on NUCA's YouTube channel and on our webinar webpage, both of which can be accessed via nuca.com. Now about your WebEx Meetings webinar screen. There are two buttons on the lower right-hand side of your screen, titled Participants and Chat. Clicking on Participants gives you a list of webinar attendees. You can chat amongst each other, or you can send the host questions or messages. All participants theoretically are muted upon entry. Phone participants can use *6 to mute and unmute themselves. Questions will be asked at the end of the webinar. To ask a question, you can submit a written question at any time using the chat feature, and I will read them at the conclusion of our panel discussion. Now let's get started. In recent months, NUCA members have experienced delays in delivery of steel, insulation, copper, brass, and PVC piping. These unexpected additional costs are wreaking havoc on existing and pending projects. What is behind this crisis, and what can NUCA members do? Our industry experts joining us today to discuss the current market supply shortages being faced by our industry's contractors include NUCA Chairman Lauren Atwell of Petticoat Schmidt Civil Contractors in Jacksonville, Florida, Tony Privatera of Mark I Electric Company in Kansas City, Missouri, Vaughn Bland of Core Maine in Glendale, Arizona, and NUCA of New Jersey, Sean Farrell of Cohen Segilius in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Sean will be moderating the panel. Each will offer their own unique experience of the supply crisis and deliver targeted advice that you will find useful to mitigate this crisis for your company and for your projects. The white paper our guests will be mentioning, Volatility in the Marketplace, Lessons Learned from Price Increases of Past Pandemics, is now available on our website, nuca.com. Thank you all for joining us today on this special NUCA Webinar Wednesday. Sean, I turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that introduction. As an owner of a firm that focuses its practice on construction law, I got to tell you, I got a lot of stories to tell you about contractors and contracts. So anyway, when I was thinking about some of the stories I could share with you as they, interrelate to your contract terms and conditions, because a lot of this material escalation cost and the problems that we're having are going to be driven, the outcome will be driven by contract terms. I was watching TV last night and I saw this, I don't know if anyone's seen it, but I saw this advertisement for insurance by Allstate. And the whole premise is that we've seen a lot and therefore we know a lot. And we know what's covered and we know what we're going to pay because we've seen it before. I think what the panel's goal here today to do is to share information with you guys so you don't have to suffer a loss to figure out whether or not it's covered by somebody. So we want to share with you ideas and contract terms and conditions and case law in a way that you can act proactively to avoid any types of loss. To that end, I know Robert mentioned that there's a white paper and a one-page synopsis. You can find that on nuca.com. And that kind of goes into, in greater detail, some of the issues that we're going to try to elaborate on and questions that we're going to try to answer here today in this presentation. I urge you to share that information with your team. And by your team, I mean internally, to your estimators, to your project management team. They should know all of this information. If they're not on the line right now, this is being recorded. They can watch it later. I also urge you to share it with your professional team. If you have lawyers, take it, share with them, get their thoughts on it. Accountants, bonding companies, your agents, let them know. They might have good ideas that are particular to your company on how you can manage this risk. And I think that this would be a good practice for you to do in this time. So with that said, the way that this seminar is going to procedurally go through is I'm going to ask some questions to the panel members. There are studies that say the best way to learn some new subject matter is to be asked questions about it and to answer those questions. So I'm going to ask the panel members about their experience with material escalation. And then while I'm doing that, I would suggest you think about how you would answer it. And then when we get to the end of that question and answer period with the panel, we're going to open it up to any questions that anybody might have on this Zoom meeting so they can ask the panel or myself any particular questions specific to you or in general terms that you might want to have a little bit more explanation on. So with all that said, let me start it off by asking a few questions, and I'll start with you, Lauren, if that's okay. That's okay. All right. So why don't we just open it up in more of a dialogue? I'm wondering if your company is experienced any material cost escalations, and if so, what are the types of material that you're seeing that is really being impacted by the current market, where I'll tell you, logistics is a big issue. People can't get containers, they can't get shipment. PVC pipe, I know in Texas there was bad storms and thaws and freezes that prevented materials that are used to make PVC pipe. What are you seeing out there, Lauren?
So we're experiencing escalation literally on a daily basis at this point. And it started with PVC pipe, but it has moved to HP pipe, it's moved to HDPE pipe. We're seeing increases escalation in ductile iron, the fittings, valves, restraints, concrete, rebar, precast, and we're seeing it in lime rock materials now, fuel. So it's a huge concern, and it's a lot of stuff we got to address here. We can address today. Look forward to these conversations.
Yeah. So when you're seeing these increase in costs, are you able to pass them along to whoever you have the contract with, like the owner, or is this something that your company's been bearing the burden of?
So unfortunately, for the most part, we're not able to pass them on. A lot of the contracts are in place and existing for these escalations to hit. So the terms weren't allowed and contracts weren't made with escalation in mind at the time when they were bid or executed. No, we haven't been able to pass them along. Now we certainly try to. We make the requests. We talk about it, and we've got a reasonable owner that can educate, and they understand what's going on. They have shared some of those expenses.
Right. So you said something very important there. Your contracts really didn't have escalation clauses in them. Are you trying to institute a new policy where you're negotiating those types of terms into your contracts?
So we absolutely are, when we're able to. So when we're bidding private work, we condition our bids and we negotiate those terms into our bids on private work. When you have an owner that can, someone you can talk to across the table. On the public work, where they're putting out a hard bid job, you don't get an opportunity to negotiate terms. So we don't get the opportunity to negotiate that. We do take the time to ask a question of the owner on public hard bid jobs. To how are they going to handle escalation? Are they worried there's a problem? How are they going to handle it? So we can see if they answer it. And in a lot of cases, the owners just don't bother to answer the question during the bid phase. And then we have to address it a different way.
So there's a couple of things. I've definitely, as a lawyer, been faced with a lot of these similar situations that you just described, Lauren. One thing to keep in mind, and for the members who are on the Zoom meeting to keep in mind is, just because a contract doesn't have an escalation clause in it, doesn't mean that you can't get an increased price for it. So one of the things that the white paper will talk about, and one of the things to explore for everyone, is to figure out whether or not this was sort of an unforeseen condition, as we kind of all know it is, but it's more than that. It can't just be an unforeseen condition. You've got to be able to associate this material price increase directly to some unforeseen condition, like a pandemic, like COVID-19. And you've got to tie them in a but-for relationship. And the more that you're able to do that, then you can go back to an owner and say, in a contractual legal manner, that the contract didn't contemplate this situation. Because in essence, a contract is a meeting of the minds of two parties, even in a public bidding. And I know, Lauren, you mentioned the public bidding where you don't get to negotiate the terms, but you see the terms up front. They provide them to you in the bid solicitation. So again, the legal construct is that it's a meeting of the minds. But when people don't speak specifically to a situation that occurs, then it becomes a question of whether or not you can associate that specific situation to the increase in the price. And if so, then you would have a valid legal claim for an increase in your price. So something to keep in mind is just don't take the contract on its face value and say, okay, well, it says I can't get this, or it doesn't have an escalation clause in there. That means that's all I've got, and I can't move on, and I can't get paid. That's not necessarily true. I'll share with you. Yeah.
If I may also elaborate there as well, not always will, you're in the middle of constructing, or you're in the middle of a project, and you're not always going to have documentation as to what, unforeseen situation happened and what's been impacting your pricing. There's not always visibility to that, at the local level at times. And that's where you can definitely engage your distributor, who has those direct relations with the manufacturers and can definitely provide you that documentation or information for you to go to your owners with. So I think we can certainly engage as partners in that exercise.
Great. That's a great point, Yvonne. Also, Lauren, I guess you mentioned that in the public bidding sector, you kind of get the contract that you have. I would just, ask everybody to be cognizant of when you're subcontracting down, you've got to make sure that those same terms and conditions are flowing down, that there's, an equilibrium between your contract going up and the contract going down, or you can find yourself in an uncomfortable middle position where potentially you owe the increased price to subcontractors, but necessarily you don't have a direct route to get paid that from the owner. So that's also something to consider there.
Sean, may I interject something on government procurement? On a lot of the larger projects, and Lauren will be aware of it, I used to be with the General Counsel's office, they have ODP. And to the extent in a pre-bid or something where you can have a situation where you can get the public owner to agree to the ODP program, so that at least they'll save the sales tax, at least the risk of the cost of the commodity and the delivery goes to them. If you can be wise enough to get them to utilize an owner direct purchase for the larger commodities.
That's right. That's right. And you should look to, that public body that you're dealing with, because there could be statutes in place that provide you with certain protection. I know in New Jersey, for instance, maybe about 5 years ago, the legislator passed an asphalt pricing index. So there was an escalation clause by statute in public works with the state of New Jersey concerning asphalt pricing, because it was so volatile that the legislature felt that it had to step in, and they gave it earmarked on a pricing index as to what the price would be at the end of the project. So also things to consider on public works projects.
Sean, if I may, on the index piece, also, some owners do refer to the index for those clauses. There's some issues with that, in particular what's happening today with the supply chain disruption. With some of those indexes don't necessarily take into consideration what's happening with our ocean freight and containers, and the tariffs and government regulations that may get instituted immediately. So the supply chain disruption could be ultimately some verbiage as well.
Right. Yeah, to the extent that you have the ability to negotiate a contract and put that kind of language in there, being specific to that supply chain is a great point, Yvonne. So let me open a couple of questions up to the group now that we're talking about the contracts. Has anyone on the panel changed their practice of performing extra work without a signed change order as a result of this price escalation situation we find ourselves in?
Well, one of the 10 rules of commandments of change orders is you shouldn't do work without a signed change order. So I would say, no, you didn't change it because of that. You should never should never do work without a signed change order to start with. That would be a first. But in pricing change orders and the terms that you put in the change orders, yes, we have changed some practices. There is an opportunity there where it is a change where they're adding pipe to you that you can ask for those escalation prices and conditions in there depending on the delivery and the time. So you're changing the contract, so now you get to change the terms for at least that portion of the work.
Right. And I guess in quantity contracts too, even on public works, if it increases past 25% of the estimated quantities, you get an opportunity on most public projects to increase the unit price that you otherwise were subject to. So another consideration to think about. But I can tell you this, Lauren, that you're 100% right that you shouldn't do work without a signed change order. The problem is a lot of these contracts now will say, if we get in a dispute over whether or not the scope of work is within your contract, you have the obligation to continue to work. Has anybody seen that kind of contract on the panel where you've got to continue working even though you don't have a signed change order?
Yeah, I think they call it a WCD, work change directive, and it allows the owner. Sorry to interrupt you, Lauren. It allows Mr. Chairman. I apologize. It allows the owner the time to, and it's contractually written where it says yes, you have to go do the work, and they, before you actually. Before they approve the price. And I've learned something, and Sean, you probably know this, that most contracts that are written by municipalities are written by the municipality or by the city for the city. And it's designed that way. And I have learned and been educating our project managers that the way to solve the problem for that type of work change directive, where they tell you to begin before they approve it, is you must have the price to them prior to that new change work beginning, and you as the contractor have to document it. See, many times they tell you to perform it, but you actually have it, meaning the contractor hasn't given the price to the owner yet, and you've started the process of doing the work. We have found that if you get the price to them as soon as possible, and your project managers are Johnny on the spot and just producing those numbers, well, then in most of the contracts, the customer needs to tell you, no, I disagree with the price. Don't proceed. So the ball falls on the contractor to timely turn in the price.
Right. That's a great point, Tony. That's a great point, Tony. And if you can't price it all up, because listen, if they're changing large segments of your work or they're resequencing your work, there could be inefficiencies associated with that new means and methods where they're really usurping your plan and coming up with their own plan of where you're going to start and finish your work and how you're going to do it. And those inefficiencies might not tie out to how you estimated your price to be. So it's not always the occasion that you know exactly what the price is. But Tony's right. You should be writing to them, notifying them and telling them, listen, there's a price increase. Here's what the estimated price is. Or let's agree to do it on a time and material basis from this point forward so that you're going to be signing tickets. I've seen cases where people have done just that. And I don't know if Tony or Lauren, you've had this, but then the construction manager or the owner's rep won't sign the tickets, And that's okay, to be honest with you. If you're keeping track of it, Tony, you got that?
You know what, Sean? So when the customer has been a little, I'll say, hiding behind the work change directive language where they're trying to tell you to go prior to actually receiving the price, but then when you timely give them the price, it kind of stymies them a little bit. And most recently, and due to some of these specific types of changes with material and labor, we've had a couple of customers try to hide behind that clause, and they said, oh, go do the job, time, and material. A couple of my PMs came to me and said, well, what do you want to do? I said, write up the ticket. I said, you know how to create the time and material ticket. You know how long the guys are going to be there. Estimate it, plan it, and get them to sign it before you begin. It's still T&M. And the guy's going to say, well, you haven't performed the work. We know how to count. We know how long it's going to take. Here you go. Now that one has held some water for us, and we have definitely caused I'll say the owners that are trying to beat us out of something. We've definitely been successful.
Yeah.
So
the more timely you are with getting that kind of notice out to them, and what I would urge everyone to do is don't just do it once, by the way. So the occurrence happens and you say, okay, now I've got a change order and we don't get into an agreement. So give me a directive and here's my price, or here's my estimated price. And they haven't signed anything. If they haven't signed a change order, they haven't amended the contract, and you still only have a claim. You don't have a signed change order. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to clients who said, yeah, we have X number of dollars owed in contract balance and X number of dollars owed in change orders, but they're unsigned change orders. So I say, you don't have any claim in change orders. You have a claim for an adjustment of your contract price, but you don't have a change order. So it's a contract. The change order itself is a contract. It has to be signed. Your contract will identify who it has to be signed by. Sometimes it's more than just the owner. It could be the owner and the architect. If your contract and the change order form requires 2 signatures from them, then you need both before you actually have a valid, legally binding change order. And when you don't have a change order, you have a claim, you have to do this. My point being, just don't tell them once. I'd tell them monthly. Every time you're filling out a payment application, and now you can't bill it because it hasn't been incorporated into your contract yet, right? So you had no schedule of values to bill it to, but you should be including in there, hey, I still have this outstanding issue. I still have this. I don't know if you have a COR log, a change order request log, whatever, but on a monthly basis, you should be passing that up. I don't know, Lauren or Tony, if you guys do that, or Yvonne, you see that, but that's the best practices, is to repeatedly do that, because listen, the squeaky wheel gets greased. And the more that you're out in front of it, reminding them that there's that cost out there, the more you're likely to resolve it. And material escalation is just one new factor of increasing your prices, and you got to treat it the same. So, Tony, let me ask you a question specifically. In addition to better contract terms, where Lauren has expressed that maybe contracts from old wouldn't have an escalation clause in them. If you don't have that escalation clause, are there other ways that your company is trying to mitigate the risk of increased material costs?
Well, of course, especially obviously on lump sum projects, you want to keep the relationship with the customer cordial and fair, but fair works both ways. Some of the cases, you definitely want to hold your supplier's feet to the fire on quotes that they've given you on projects, and in some cases, like copper or PVC, where they just can't do it. Now, we've said that our customers are our partners, but our suppliers are too. We need to take care of our suppliers. They're our friends. They're the ones that give us the quotes every day, and we don't want to hurt them, And what we have found is that it really is forcing our project management team to really look for what Lauren said before, opportunities for when there's a delay, when there's something that the owner is supposed to do, you need to capitalize on that, and you definitely need to use that opportunity to pick up those extra dollars. And in some cases, you try to plan things a little bit more efficiently. You're supposed to do it efficient to begin with, but other things that have taken place that I know I've been successful with is when I saw the price increasing and I knew, and the customer knew that this material wasn't needed for 8 and 9 months, I explained to them the price increase that we were going to incur, and I gave them a deadline. Hey, if you let me buy all this material in advance, I'm not going to come back and ask you for more money. Will you let me charge you for this material and for stored material early in the project? And so far, that particular aspect of it has panned out the best. Get them to pay for stored material early, because it'll prevent this issue from coming up at a later date.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, is getting the owner to recognize that stored material, it benefits both people. I mean, these are unprecedented times when we have material prices, increasing at this unforeseen pace, right? So if the owner realizes that his job is more likely to finish on time,
yes,
and on budget, if he's willing to just put that money out a little bit sooner, he's going to have to pay for it eventually. So there's an education process with owners, but once they understand that they're really is sort of risk aversion, they're staying away from risk, they're staying away from bad times if they get in front of it and do it early. I found that owners and developers and utility companies, they're willing to understand that, and they're willing to work with you. And to that point, I don't know if you guys have experienced this with the escalation clauses. These are two-way streets. I mean, you can put a fair escalation clause in there that benefits the owner. Tony, did you want to talk about that?
Sure. I mean, we have escalation clauses that are built into many of our repetitive contracts, but it's basically mostly for the labor, not for the material. It isn't. We've started the process of just talking to them. It's working. And I was actually talking to Lauren about this weekend. And in one particular case, I mentioned to an owner about this situation, and I said, look, we've got this big project. We've got all these different material escalations and issues. I said, what problems are you having on your side of the table? And he said, well, we've earmarked all this money for you, but we really don't understand how the money is going to come out. So I said, well, why don't I send you the spend curve? And that's what I call it, where we send to them how we anticipate billing you from now. Say it's a 12 months project. We say, let's agree to what the bill's going to be for 10 months. I said, let's make it easy on your project management team. It'll be easy on our accounting department. I said, and now you've got it earmarked. Well, that gives us 10 months to get the job rolling, communicate better, and then the last 2 months will be more of a settle up month. That has been working. Some of our owners have made the decision to buy their own material, and they're in the same boat right now as the contractor. So those particular owners are understanding it the best.
Yeah.
So,
and with a fair escalation clause, just to add to that, with a fair escalation clause, the owner can reap the benefit if the prices actually go down.
Goes down, right?
Yeah. So I mean, that's what they have to understand is, listen, this is not a contractor trying to profiteer from a situation and make all this extra money. This is someone who's presenting you with a fair alternative so that we can really get the project done and on budget. And if it increases, it's only going to increase because of these unknowns. And if it decreases, you get the benefit of that. And so, once you're transparent with that kind of stuff, it goes a long way to educate these owners. And that's what's key, is education. Because I can tell you, I'll say I was recently speaking to head of construction for the 4th largest toll road in America, and I'll say it that way. And this individual, and we were talking about material escalation, and obviously it's a public bidding process for the toll roads on the Northeast, so it's a public sector. And this person was telling me all the right things, where he viewed the relationship with his contractors as a partnership. And he understood that material was increasing in ways that no one could have anticipated. And he looked to work with contractors to help them out. And I think the more that we can, do education to the owners individually and speak in one voice, I think that's important too. And Lauren, I know that was important to you. And for one of the reasons to have this is for us to figure out a way as a group to speak with one voice on these issues. So all the owners kind of, not that there's a meeting of all the owners in the world, but at least they start to understand that there's consistency throughout the industry. So
a great resource to have those conversations with those owners is to use our vendors and use NUCA, the white letter that we've prepared, to use the letters that Core and Maine have prepared and got from their vendors and Ferguson, so that message is the same if you're pulling from those sources to educate your owners.
Right, because there is some movement with volume. If everyone's saying the same thing and experience the same events, owners understand it and usually are willing to work with contractors, again, when they just don't think that the contractor is looking to make up for a failed bid or something along those lines, when there's really something that's impacting the industry as a whole. They're willing to make accommodations, and that's what we've got to hopefully get to. So, Yvonne, I've been ignoring you and I don't want to, so
Okay.
let's talk about distributors for a little bit. How do distributors announce price increases? Can you walk us through that process so everyone can kind of understand how that, from your angle and from your perspective, looks like and what they can anticipate?
Well, I think it's maybe different across the spectrum of distributors, but typically when we receive I'll say typically prior pandemic, when we receive an increased letter of some sort, and we generally had seen them maybe once a year from some products, maybe a few times, we would then transition and allow our folks in the field across the country to advise their customers that the prices were going up. Let's take a look at your projects in advance, and let's kind of take care of what you've got going on. Sometimes we put out letters at the local branch levels and so forth. Well, we're still in the pandemic, but post what's happened with the pandemic, we've had just this year alone almost 300 increases, categories increase. So if you can imagine, that's just pretty dramatic, and often historically we would have a grace period of 30 days maybe, or some kind of grace period given to us by the manufacturers. Now we're having price points on demand. PVC, for example, has come to a point in some cases where your price is the day is shipping because of the demand. Now backlog is smoothing, and obviously distributors probably have more pipe on the ground than the manufacturers do right now, but in essence, we're all working through that backlog, and we'll continue to put out letters of any kind of increase events.
Excellent. Let me ask you about contracting terms from the distributor side. Do distributors usually require escalation clauses into their purchase orders with contractors?
So generally, the contractor is the first line of defense, if you will, for the contract negotiation, right? We're all working together when it comes time for bidding, and we look at the owner's documentation, what's requirements, and so forth. So we would then go to the manufacturers and speak to the manufacturers about timelines for price terms. What they would be able to do. Some of them give us a price term, 30 days, tomorrow, 6 months, a year, whatever it is, and then they want to put escalation clauses in. That's when the conversation turns, when we speak with the contractor and indicate this particular vendor of this product is looking at potential escalation clauses. We need to influence the negotiations for the final contract. So I think it's a all through the works of the project, from bidding time there's basically 3 or 4 phases where the negotiations can take place in discussions regarding escalations. The biggest thing for escalation discussions and allowance in contracts is to get very specific, because those contingency clauses can get wrapped around the axle at times if you're not real specific on how that works. You know, I've seen some where manufacturers, just because the escalation clause is there, they just want to throw in the increase. And, you know, we want to have substantiation behind why the product's being increased, right? And I think that's should be an expectation for the contractor as well, to have that substantiation, be able to provide to the owner. And that's what we're, you know, that's what we're here to do, is to help through that process.
Right, right. And how are you, maybe you can share with the group some of the ways that you're trying to work with the contractors to solve the problem. I think you just mentioned one where you're working with the manufacturer to make sure that they're substantiating the need for the increase, and you're really doing that for your benefit, but also it helps out both you and the contractor. Are there other ways that you're doing it? Maybe, you know, I don't know, locking into numbers with contractors for extended periods of time, or trying to explore ways that they can buy in bulk? Are there ways that you're working with contractors to help solve this?
Yeah, you've named a few right there. I think I think earlier Tony or Lauren had mentioned, you know, the buying materials. The only caution there with the buy and store materials is make sure there's explicit language in the contract as to when that gets paid from the owner, right? They do pay for store materials, but if there is not a specification on when that payment comes through, I think you'll have some challenges as to when you can put the billing in for that. We have seen some things like that. But we do, look, we're a major distributor, and there's distributors all across the country. We all stock products for a reason, right? We're not just trying to be just-in-time delivery. We want to make sure that we're supplementing your needs. So we have backup materials many times that we can help, you know, fill a problem hole that, you know, a job may be missing some materials or what have you. We have the ability to work across the channels across the country to obtain that material. So there's just a huge network there of support that would be available.
Right, right. That's great. So one of the things that I wanted to definitely highlight that's in the papers that NUCA is publishing is the requirement for notice. And we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but every contract is going to have a notice provision in there. It usually starts off that if the contractor is seeking additional money or time within blank days, maybe 7, maybe 21, less in some occasions, from the first occurrence of the event. From the first occurrence of the event, you have to put the owner, or if you're a sub, the GC on notice of any cost increase. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is that that's a very, even if they give you 21 days, that's a very subjective idea of when did that first occurrence happen. And oftentimes people might think, well, this happened last month and we had 3 days to put them on notice. We've blown the notice. We can't any longer ask for additional money or time related to these events. That's not necessarily true, okay? These contractual statutes of limitations, to be enforceable, they have to subject the other party to some type of prejudice. For example, if the owner was could have redesigned the project so that he could have avoided this occurrence had you told him earlier, then that would be somewhere where your late notice might have prejudiced the owner. But if the owner's response is going to be, and this is the typical response, hey, you contractor, you figure it out and get it done on time, well, then they're just turning back to you. There's really no prejudice that has befallen them for the lack of the notice. So know of your notice provisions. Try to the best of your ability, comply with those notice provisions. But if you fail to do that, get it out there as quickly as possible, and understand that it might not be a forfeiture of your right to seek additional monies or cost or time related to your contract. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, because I know, and Lauren and Tony, I'm sure you can share with the group. The first thing that most owners say back is, you're out of time. I didn't know this, and you signed the contract, and I'm sorry, you can't change it, and the notice provision was breached, and this is all on you now, right? You guys seen that before?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sean, so the key issue is, this is a tough situation for everybody, but it is definitely, in our particular case, causing us to really be on our game with respect to how our project managers are communicating. And I can't stress enough about the timeliness of the response on the potential change for those types of contracts. And in this particular case, as if we're all singing the same tune, they're not just hiring civil contractors, they're hiring, all types for these projects. And if we're all saying the same thing, it's going to be pretty hard for the owner to, or the owner's rep to go to the leader and say, hey, we got 16 contractors all saying the same thing. We need to help them. And that's really the intent here.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I can tell you, you touched on something that is near and dear to my heart, because I've given more than one seminar and presentation on the importance of project management.
Yeah.
And it is key. It is vital to success, is to have somebody out there that is writing the correct letters, trying to do it timely, and they don't have to be letters. They can be emails as well. Courts recognize that as a writing and email. So I get that question a lot: is an email a writing when the contract says everything must be in writing? An email is writing. So it's recognized. In fact, nowadays, most states have statutes that say you can e-sign on everything, and it's as binding as you actually signing and putting a seal on it in the old days, right? So project management is key. I've recently had one of my larger clients. They're in the pharmaceutical space, but they're impacted by all these issues as well. And they are now asking me to go back through their contracts, pull out these key terms on change orders, constructive change directives. I think, Tony, you had a different name for it, but that's where the owner's directing you to do certain work.
Correct.
And that's key, because if they won't sign the change order, by the way, and I'll digress for a second, I'll interrupt myself and digress. The construction change directives takes away half of the fight on a change order. So a change order, usually the fight will be, is it in my scope or isn't it in my scope? And then the second half of that fight is, what's the cost of the change order, right? When you get them to direct you in a constructive change directive situation, when they direct you to do it, there's no more fight on it's outside of my scope of work. Now the only fight is the price. That's a situation where every contractor should be able to settle their own dispute and close out the project without the need for a lawyer. Why? Because the other side knows they're going to pay. It's not free now. I'm going to pay something. And then if you have the T&Ms that are signed that we talked about, or you have the estimates to say it's
Sean, you're
You muted yourself, Sean, or something happened.
Oh,
I'm back.
I'm back.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, great. So I was saying on the constructive change directive, and if I repeat myself, I'm sorry, I don't know where I left off. On the constructive change directive, it's a very important thing, because it takes away half the fight, which is whether or not it's in your scope or outside of your scope. And when you have only left at the end of the job, what is the fair price for the work that was performed? That's something contractors should be able to resolve without the need for any legal professionals. You should be able to close that out, because the owner knows it's paying something. It might haggle with you. It might look for a little bit of a discount. But the reality is, it knows that it can't go further into any sort of ADR or litigation, because it's going to lose, and then potentially subject itself to interest and attorney's fees for having to push you into that area to get paid. So it's very important that you get that constructive change directive. So I started all this with talking about one of my clients that are having me now go back through these terms, the change order provisions, the escalation clause provisions, the notice provisions, and kind of put together a cheat sheet of what those terms say. Because if you use the same form subcontract, you won't with, going up to an owner and a public owner. But if you know these terms and your project manager knows those terms cold, then he can or she can get the right letters out timely to respond to this and protect the company. And the more that you train them, your project managers, to do that, the more that you can focus on other business crises of your company and not have to worry, well, what's going on in this one individual project? Because I know my team knows what the key terms are and they know how to respond. They've got form letters almost to kind of take from and develop and to send off. And to me, that's the best practices that you can do here. I don't know. Do you guys Lauren, do you do that at all? Do you talk to your project management team about what the key terms in the contract are, or are you going to start to institute that if you're not?
So we do, and besides collecting the money, as part of this whole process and recouping some money or recovering some money, we're talking about the need for top-notch project management. There's other ways to mitigate costs too, and getting your purchases done early, getting the submittals done, getting the materials delivered, and then if you get them there delivered early, you've got to set up inventory control and how you're going to store the materials, getting paid for those stored materials, and there's a lot of alternate products that you can use. You can, if you get the PVC pipe, there's no restraints can't be found anywhere. So do you go to Reebok gaskets, and do you use push joint fittings with gripper gaskets instead of Megalux? So the PM's critical in all this stuff right now, whether it's recovering your money or finding other ways to mitigate your exposure.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey,
and
just
and Lauren and Tony, this is Kim Horn with Ferguson Waterworks. I would add to that when your project managers on that side, but also on the supply side, we are, I don't want to say rationing, but we're having the troubles of getting the materials in, and fittings we ordered today may deliver in November. So we're trying very hard to be on top of our game. So if your PMs are looking further ahead than they normally do, they could let a supplier know, I want to start here, here, here. This is what I need. And then we can, as suppliers, try and make sure that we can shift, move, get in time to do that. That the last minute where we used to have stockpiles is no longer a viable option now. So the more communication with your suppliers, the better off we'll be there, so that we can all coordinate, make sure we shift inventories from some of our other locations or whatever we can do to keep you working. So communication on the supplier side is just as important right now as it is with your owners and your field personnel. Just anything you can do to keep us informed of your schedules or possible schedules, so that we can make sure we're ready when you are, or as ready as we can be.
You're right on the money. Here in the last 2 weeks, we bid a project, but we were extremely honest with the customer and told them that we could not achieve the time schedule. Explained why, because of a supplier issue. Told them when we thought we could actually get the job done and priced it accordingly. Got a phone call from the customer, said, hey, I want you to know that you are not the low bidder, but you're the only one that told the truth, and we're going to give you the job anyways. Do it next year. So I honestly believe that the key takeaway points from our meeting today is time is of the essence on communication. Whether you are writing a change order or whether you're just contemplating quoting chapter and verse of the contract. Contract's written for both parties. It's okay to say to the customer, hey, per the contract, you're supposed to do the following things, but you just cannot be afraid to talk to them in a very frank manner like we're talking right now. I think they'll appreciate it.
Yeah,
They do.
I think that's a great idea. And by the way, even if you were to lock into a contract, if you told them the basis for that schedule was dependent upon a supplier providing you with
Yes.
a shipment, and then that got pushed, you're going to be entitled to an extension of time, hands down. I mean, so it's smart on many ways. It's smart because you're being transparent to the owner. You're getting his cooperation, the partnership that we talked about, and might even get you the job as you got it. But it will also aid you in the execution of that contract, because when these things don't happen, they understood that that was a shared risk, that you weren't just saying summarily, I'll get it done by X date. You were saying, if this happens, I'll get it done by X date. I don't control this. So if it doesn't happen, there's going to be a request for time coming that will be not only allowed, but potentially compensable. So that's good.
So, Sean and Lauren, this opportunity is a learning experience for our younger project managers. We've been around the block a few times and aren't afraid to speak up for ourselves. But, when you've got, a lot of people out there managing a lot of projects, now's the time to really be watching what the younger PMs are doing, because they may have a little fear in having these types of discussions.
Yeah. Well, once they know that it's the norm, that people are doing it in mass, I think, again, there's some benefit to the volume, when everyone's singing the same song, to make that metaphor, right? So,
yes.
One more thing that I wanted to add, because we talked about, and I think it's a great mitigating tool, which is getting paid for stored material. Anytime anybody talks about payment for stored material, I mean, that's fantastic. But in my mind, I always think, who's going to protect that material as well? Because that's something in that same clause when you say, hey, I'm going to potentially bring you stored material, I'll give you a bill of sale, you pay me for it, or we're going to store it here, or I'm going to put it in the warehouse, whatever. Who's controlling that? Who's going to move it? Who's going to ship it? Where's the point of exchange, and who is the risk if it gets damaged along the way? Those are other things that will maybe not have as great of an impact on your bottom line as a material price increase, but it won't help if everyone's looking and pointing the fingers as to who's got the responsibility to protect material. And definitely, you can use your iPhone and get some great pictures of how you left it. So if it's not that way when you get back, you can say, well, someone else must have damaged this when I wasn't here. So that's always something to keep in mind as well.
Sean, that's really important too. I had an experience probably about 20, 25 years ago where an owner decided, because of some volatility in the market back then even, that they would purchase the large diameter PVC themselves. Had it delivered to site and had it strung out until the contractor was planned to do the project. Problem was the project got delayed several times, and then finally, by the time the contractor was able to install the materials, the pipe was fine. There's no damage to the pipe from being laid out, but when they put it together, they could not get it to pass testing, and whether critters had crawled in it or whatever. So there is a lot of importance, to your point, of having those stipulations, about the materials, where it's being stored, who owns it, what happens to it, if there's some damage or if there's a problem with the material later. Those are all hugely important.
Yeah, and it can cause delay on the job, because now you're back out there, but now that the material is damaged and you're fighting over who's going to pay for the replacement costs. I had that on a power plant recently, and it was a huge dollar factor. Not only was the material itself and the equipment expensive, but the delay aspect to the entire project was unbearable. The liquidated damages were extremely high. So, protection of that stored material is the next thing you should think about. The game's not over just because you convince them to pay for the stored material.
Right.
Who's got the obligation to protect it? Who's turning it over to whom if there's a suspension of the work, and who's responsible to watch it in that suspension? So, I think that is Robert, all the questions that I had for the panel. We've gone for about an hour. I think if I haven't been able to ask my panel members all the questions that everybody has been thinking about over the last few months on this issue, I think this might be a good time to turn it back over to the group and see if there's some questions we missed that we might want to fill in the blanks on.
Sean, I do have one. It's from our chat feature. If you'd like to ask a question, you can certainly write it down, or you've seen it as well too. People are just unmuting themselves. stating their name and company and asking the question. Here's the question. This question is asked within terms of a binding contractual agreements which had taken place prior to force majeure. Question is, can contractors use change conditions as a means to justify passing along price increases from contractor to owner?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there. I'll take the first stab at this, and I'll ask for everyone's personal experience on it. So if you have a change conditions, often there may be a differing site conditions clause in your contract. So that'll be a clause that'll shift the risk to the owner for things that were unknown. In federal contracting, for example, the federal acquisition regulations mandate that a DSC clause, a differing site condition clause, be in there. Most state municipal contracts kind of mirror the federal acquisition regulations. They try to anyway. Most of them, they don't have to though. So that's the first starting ground to see if it's in there. But a true change condition that forces the project into a different time period would definitely result in a compensable, meaning that the owner would owe the additional money to make that contractor whole because he didn't put himself in that area. So again, you would have to associate that delay, whatever the change condition was. Say you got on site and there was hazardous soil and no one thought there was going to be hazardous soil and you had to deal with that, and that pushed you into a new month or a new season, and therefore the cost of the material went up or the cost of the labor went up. There could be situations where you're just going to have, for those who might be on the line or, in collective bargaining agreements, could be, if it pushed it into a new month, that the labor wage rate would go up. Both of those occasions, if the catalyst to the change in the schedule happened outside of your control, and you can associate that dollar, that extra cost wouldn't have happened but for the slippage of the schedule, you should be able to get paid, unless there's some specific term where you accepted that risk. So I hope that answers the question. There's a lot of nuances there, obviously, because the key is the association to the increase in cost. If, for example, you gave a very detailed schedule and you broke out when you anticipated to even purchase it, if you gave a cost-loaded schedule where you're kind of identifying and being transparent as to when you're going to make certain purchases, that would aid in establishing that but-for causal relationship for materials. And again, for labor, I think what you're going to be faced with are wage increases, and potentially, if you don't get an extension of time because of that, because you certainly, if you're running into unknown conditions that are pushing the project schedule, you should be asking for time as well as money. And if they say no to the time, then what I often see is you've got like a 2-year project and there's, let's say, hazardous soil or something, design changes that only gives you a year and they don't give you additional time. Well, what's that going to do to your labor? Your labor is going to spike. You might have anticipated, a normal distribution over a regular bell-shaped curve where you're going to start like, 5 people, ramp up to 20 and start to ramp down. But when you don't have that full time, then you're going to spike up to maybe 30 or 40. Those additional men in that time period would be additional costs related to the delay, as well as any overtime associated with that. So that was a very long answer because that question, while simple, was very complex and there's a lot of nuances to it. Tony, Lauren, have you had any such experiences? Do you see anything differently or similarly?
I have, and I think to answer this question, as it specifically relates to material, many of our scope letters, and I would say many of the contractors that are on the call, do say that we're going to work in an efficient, workmanlike manner. Many times, if we have a material shortage, it really doesn't even pay to get on the job site to install things in a piecemeal basis. All right. So a material shortage could cause and could be considered changed conditions, which allows us to not work in an efficient, workmanlike manner. So if you think about the way I said that, all right, I have used that and I have one.
Thank you,
Lauren,
Tony.
have you seen that? I'm putting you on the spot, Lauren, to see if you've had similar occasions.
I was muted. We have been fortunate to we have gotten paid just by conversations with under changed conditions with owners for some material escalations, and under force majeure gotten. Our force majeure technically covers time. We've associated extension costs and cost to run bypass pumps and stuff with the extension due to items being delayed for COVID. So it's, one of the other commandments of change orders, ask not, receive it not. So you gotta ask.
Yeah.
Do it in a manner that be successful.
Well, Lauren just said 2 points worth a little bit of expanding on and repetition. One is a force majeure clause typically will only give you time, not money. In this material escalation world we find ourselves, time might not be your friend. I mean, there's no saying that if they said, okay, I understand you're impacted because of COVID-19, for example, here's another year to do the job. There's no saying that in a year prices are going to be lower. Maybe they will be. Maybe you'll catch that opportunity in that break, but maybe they'll be higher. So it's not enough to fall back on force majeure as a save-all kind of clause. Force majeure, as routinely written, again, the devil's in the details of your contract and how it's actually phrased. But typically, it would only entitle you to time. Again, the key to either unknown differing site conditions or unforeseen conditions and getting it paid more money, or using force majeure and getting paid more money, which Lauren inferred, but I'm going to say directly, it's making that causal connection between the impact, whatever is causing you that delay that you would otherwise get time for, and the cost increase. And the more that you can connect that, the more likely you are to get compensated for it. And put it in writing and send it to them and talk about it. Use every tool at your disposal. Meeting minutes, you should be discussing it, and the meeting minutes should reflect it. Your notes, if you're keeping notebooks, your project management team should be noting it. You should have its change order log, and every 30 days, you're identifying it as still an issue to the owner. Those are the best practices that I've seen when I'm advising my clients. It keeps them out of litigation. And God forbid you find yourself in litigation and you have to go to court. These are like gifts to me because it's the best evidence that you're entitled to additional money. Whether you're before a judge, a jury, or an arbitrator, when you can show contemporaneous documentation that you're telling everybody it's an additional cost and you're doing your best to quantify it in real time, it is persuasive to the other side or the trier of fact, the person who's going to make the decision on your case, to grant you the relief you're looking for when you've got that kind of documentation.
Sean, it's important. You made mention about meeting minutes. I cannot tell you how much I 100,000% agree with you regarding the meeting minutes, because some of these issues don't get resolved immediately. Sometimes the issues get resolved way down the road, and the meeting minutes come into a big play in how the case gets reviewed.
Yeah, agreed.
If there are no other questions, and it appears there's not, we're already at the top of the hour. I guess we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Sean, Yvonne, Lauren, and Tony, thank you very much for your time today to participate in this panel. We'd also like to thank our national partners, their generosity supporting NUCA and our monthly webinar series. Today's webinar has been recorded. A recording of this webinar will be also made available on the NUCA.com website and our YouTube channel over the next few days. And thank you for your time today to join us for this special webinar Wednesday and supporting NUCA. Thank you for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of your week.